She didn't say she hated me. She just kept reminding me how much better other men were. Comparison doesn't always sound like an insult. Sometimes it comes wrapped in advice, concern, or motivation. That's why it hurts so deeply, because it slowly convinces you that you're not enough, without ever saying it directly. That's how it started with us at first. It seemed harmless. She would mention other men, casually. Look how driven he is. He already owns a house. His wife doesn't have to worry about money. She never raised her voice. She never insulted me directly. But each comparison landed quietly and stayed. I tried not to take it personally. I told myself she was just expressing her expectations, that she wanted a better future, that comparison was normal. Everyone compares sometimes, right? But there's a difference between inspiration and humiliation. And slowly, that line disappeared. Every time I shared a goal, she compared it to someone else's achievement. Every time I spoke about effort, she pointed to someone's results. Every time I needed encouragement, I was reminded of how far behind I was. I started feeling like I was competing in a race I never signed up for. What hurt most was that she never asked how hard I was trying. She didn't see the pressure I carried silently. The late nights, the uncertainty, the constant effort to improve without guarantees. She only saw outcomes, and when outcomes don't come fast enough, comparison becomes a weapon. I remember one specific moment clearly. We were sitting together, scrolling through our phones. She stopped on a picture, someone we both knew, successful, confident, smiling. She looked at me and said, "Why can't you be more like him?" It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, it was casual, and that made it worse, because in that moment, I didn't feel challenged. I felt replaced. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I laughed it off and changed the topic. But something inside me shifted. A quiet realization that the person I loved was slowly losing respect for me, not because I was doing nothing, but because I wasn't winning fast enough. From that day on, I became more self-conscious. I questioned my progress. I measured myself against strangers. I doubted decisions I once felt confident about. Comparison does that. It doesn't push you forward. It pulls you apart. I started trying harder, not out of passion, but out of pressure. I wanted to prove that I was worthy of being chosen, that I deserved to stand beside her, that I wasn't less. But effort fueled by fear never feels like growth. It feels like survival. And the more I tried, the more comparisons appeared. If I improved, it wasn't enough. If I struggled, it was proof. If I succeeded quietly, it was ignored. Love slowly turned into evaluation instead of feeling supported. I felt observed, measured, ranked, and yet I stayed. Because when someone you care about compares you to others, you don't just fear losing them, you fear losing your identity. I told myself she meant well. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself that if I just became better, stronger, more successful, the comparisons would stop. They did in single quotes, because comparison isn't about improvement. It's about dissatisfaction. And dissatisfaction, when left unchecked, grows. What I didn't realize then was that her comparisons said more about her inner fears than my worth. But when you're in the middle of it, clarity is hard to find. All you feel is pressure. One evening, after another subtle comparison, I went quiet. Not angry, just tired. She noticed and asked what was wrong. I almost told her everything, how small I felt, how exhausted I was, how deeply the comparisons were affecting me. But instead, I said nothing, because explaining your pain to someone who caused it feels risky. You don't know if they'll understand or dismiss it again. So I stayed silent, and that silence marked the beginning of a shift. I stopped trying to impress her, stopped competing with other men. I stopped measuring myself through her expectations, not because I gave up, but because I realized something important. If someone only sees your value through comparison, they don't truly see you at all. That realization didn't bring peace immediately, but it planted a seed that would grow quietly, while she continued comparing. And one day, that same habit, the habit of comparison, would force her to confront a truth she never expected: regret. The moment I stopped competing with other men was the moment my life finally moved forward. Once I recognized how deeply comparison was affecting me, I made a quiet decision, one that no one noticed at first. I stopped participating in it, not outwardly, not through arguments or ultimatums, but internally. I stopped measuring myself against people she mentioned. I stopped reacting to names, achievements, and timelines that weren't mine. I stopped allowing someone else's expectations to define my pace. That shift didn't happen overnight. At first, comparison had become a habit. Her words echoed in my head even when she wasn't around. Every success I saw online felt like evidence against me. Every delay felt like confirmation that I was behind. But slowly, I caught myself. I reminded myself that growth isn't a race, that everyone's path looks different, that progress made quietly is still progress. And with that realization, something changed. I stopped explaining my plans to her. I stopped seeking her approval. I focused on execution. Instead of validation, the emotional dynamic between us shifted. She noticed my distance, not physical distance, but emotional independence. I was calmer, less reactive, less eager to prove myself, and that confused her. She asked fewer questions about my goals. She tested me with comparisons and got no reaction. She watched me become more self-contained, and when comparisons stop working, people often feel unsettled, because comparison only has power when the other person accepts it. I wasn't angry. I wasn't resentful. I was simply done. I began investing my energy differently. I built skills. I focused on consistency. I worked on things that wouldn't show results immediately, but would matter long term. I learned to trust my own timeline. That's when real growth started. Not dramatic success, not instant recognition, just steady, undeniable improvement. I felt stronger mentally, more grounded, less anxious. For the first time in a long while, I felt like myself again, not a version shaped by comparison, but one guided by purpose. The relationship, however, started to feel unbalanced. Without comparison, there was little left to talk about. Without pressure, the dynamic changed. She seemed less engaged, less certain. The confidence she once carried while comparing me to others started to fade. One day, she said something that revealed everything. "You've changed." She didn't mean it as a compliment. She meant I was no longer trying to impress her, and she was right. I had stopped performing, stopped competing, stopped seeking validation that change wasn't about her, it was about survival, because constant comparison doesn't just hurt your confidence, it slowly erases your identity. I needed space to rebuild mine. The more grounded I became, the clearer things looked. I could see how comparison had become her way of coping with her own fears. Fear of stagnation, fear of uncertainty, fear of falling behind others, but her fears were no longer my responsibility. Wasn't cruel about it. I wasn't dismissive. I was simply unavailable for comparison, and that absence did something powerful. It forced her to face a relationship without leverage, no rankings, no examples, no pressure tactics, just a people or not. And that's when the regret began to take shape. Not loudly, not immediately, but subtly. She noticed the distance. She noticed that I was growing in ways she couldn't measure, that my confidence didn't depend on her opinion anymore. And for the first time, she realized something uncomfortable. By comparing me to other men, she had pushed me out of reach, but the full weight of that realization hadn't hit her yet. That would come later, when comparison no longer gave her control, and when the man she once measured began to stand firmly on his own. The day she stopped comparing me to other men was the day she realized regret doesn't always arrive with tears or apologies. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the form of confusion, distance, and the sudden awareness that control is gone. That's how it happened with her. For a long time, comparison had given her certainty. It allowed her to feel ahead, informed, in control. By pointing to other men, she didn't have to sit with uncertainty or patience. Comparison was easier than understanding. But once I stepped out of that dynamic, she had nothing left to measure, and that scared her. She started noticing things she had ignored before. My calm, my consistency, my independence. I wasn't louder. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't chasing attention or approval. I was simply moving forward on my terms, and that's when she began to regret the comparisons, not because she suddenly became kind, but because she realized their cost. She tried to reconnect in subtle ways, more questions about my life, more interest in my plans, more curiosity about my thoughts, but something had changed. I answered politely, but without urgency. I shared selectively. I no longer felt the need to invite her into every part of my journey, not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. One evening, she finally said it. "I didn't mean to make you feel less." That sentence carried weight, because intent doesn't erase impact. I listened calmly, without anger, and for the first time, she truly listened to, not to respond, but to understand. She admitted that comparison had been a mistake, that she thought it would motivate me, that she didn't realize how deeply it had hurt, or how far it had pushed me away. And then came the hardest part for her. She admitted fear, fear that she might have lost me emotionally long before realizing it. Fear that by constantly looking outward, she failed to value what was right in front of her. That's the thing about comparison, it blinds you. You stop seeing effort, you stop seeing character, you stop seeing growth. You only see timelines that aren't yours. Her regret was real, but regret doesn't always mean repair. By the time she understood, I had already grown into someone who no longer needed to be compared or chosen to feel complete. I told her the truth, that being compared constantly made me feel invisible, that it replaced encouragement with pressure, that it turned love into evaluation, and that stepping away from comparison was the healthiest decision I had made. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. She just listened. And that silence told me everything. Sometimes people regret their behavior, not because they understand your pain, but because they finally feel the consequences of it. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't dismissive, but I was honest. I told her that respect cannot grow in the shadow of comparison, that love needs appreciation, not ranking, and that once self-respect is rebuilt, it cannot be traded for approval again. She understood, too late, but clearly. We didn't end things dramatically. There was no fight, no blame, just clarity, a mutual understanding that something important had been damaged, not by lack of effort, but by lack of respect. And here's the truth: most people avoid. Comparison doesn't motivate healthy growth. It creates quiet resentment, and resentment eventually creates distance. Looking back now, I don't feel anger toward her. I feel gratitude, because her comparisons forced me to stop living through someone else's expectations. They pushed me to define success on my own terms. They taught me that confidence built internally cannot be shaken by external opinions, and they taught her a lesson too. One she won't forget, that constantly comparing someone you claim to care about is a slow way of losing them. Final YouTube. Outro high attention lesson. If someone keeps comparing you to others, remember this: the right person will see your progress, not measure it against someone else's timeline.